Hi, everyone. We're excited to welcome you to our final webinar in this series on GSV's Ventures Learning and Earning Forecast for 2025 and 2026. If you haven't had a chance to look at the full report yet, I'm going to drop the link below so you can explore it, check it out at your leisure. Today, we're going to be diving into Theme 7 on navigating human and AI relationships and how the rise of emotionally responsive AI is reshaping not only how people interact with technology, but also how people interact with each other. AI now can sustain conversations and have memory for months, years even, learn individuals' personalities and habits, and increasingly is meeting the emotional and psychological needs of adults, teenagers, and even children. And some of these interactions can be extremely validating for the users, but they can also raise real concerns around over-reliance, social and relational development, and emotional health, especially for young people. Notably, there's a recent survey which found almost 1/3 of US teens report that conversations with AI feel as satisfying or even more satisfying than those with real life friends. So as these human and AI relationships become more normalized, schools and caregivers, educators are being pulled into entirely new questions around relational intelligence, digital boundaries, emotional development, and what preparation for this world should actually look like. Before we jump in and I introduce our amazing guest panelists for today, there's just a quick note that we'll be watching the comments throughout the session, and we'll save about 15 minutes in the end for Q&A. So please, add your questions and reactions as we go along. Okay, so to explore today's topic, I'm going to be joined by my co-host and partner at GSV, Claire Zhao, and two incredible guests. The first is Daphne Lee, CEO of Common Sense Privacy, who brings deep expertise on youth safety, data protection, and family trust in the digital age. And we'll also be joined by Julia Freeland Fisher, the Director of Education at the Christensen Institute, and whose work and research is focused on how innovation reshapes learning environments and relationships. So let's welcome Daphne, Julia, and Claire. Okay, so to get started, I'm going to do some basic level setting, and I'd like to hear from both of you guys on this question. And perhaps we'll start with you, Julia, and then go to Daphne. But there's been a lot of press highlighting the adoption of AI by teens and the growing use of companionship and emotional psychological use cases, basically at all ages. How are you seeing AI products influence not only human-machine relationships, but also human-human relationships so far?
Yeah, huge question. I'll do my best to just kind of summarize the state of the state. It's moving really quickly, but I think it's a really timely question to be asking. So I think just to level set, we have to remember that young people and all of us as human beings are deeply wired to connect. And it's not necessarily a new phenomenon to seek connection or to satisfy that need by turning to technology, right? We have a long history of parasocial relationships that have been studied in depth. What's different in this moment that you alluded to, Jennifer, is just this idea that with anthropomorphic bots that have both memory and sort of natural language capabilities and conversational capabilities that previous technologies haven't, that these technologies can actually align much more deeply to that deeply wired need to connect, that they can behave in ways that mirror social support theory, developmental relationships theory, many theories that anyone steeped in youth development have heard about for a long time are critical to healthy development. And so that's really the game changer here that makes this technology kind of perfectly poised to disrupt human connection as we know it. We know from Common Sense, Daphne, sorry to scoop you on some of the data coming out of your partners at Common Sense Media, but half of teens use AI companions monthly. That came from the same survey that Jennifer, you were citing in terms of sort of satisfaction with those interactions. We know from Institute for Family Studies that 1 in 4 young adults say AI could replace real romantic relationships. We know 1 in 8 young people report turning to AI for mental health support, which may or may not be a sort of relational interaction, but certainly is underscoring this idea that bots are providing emotional and social support. And lastly, not even sort of specific to young people, but to all of us, and I want to just underscore this for listeners, that it can be really tempting to be like, oh, young people are so crazy, they're bonding with bots. This is actually happening across the age distribution. And what we see is that productivity apps are also companion apps. So we're not just talking about character AI or replica or some of the kind of romantic companion apps that I think sometimes get covered more in this conversation. We're talking about ChatGPT and Gemini and DeepSeek all engaging in companion-like behaviors that again appeal to our deeply wired, evolutionarily sound need to connect. And I think that actually becomes really, really important when we're talking about the education use case, because if you look at benchmarks like Intima and some of the other benchmarks now coming out looking at the sort of companion-like behaviors of these tools, just because something is being sold as a productivity app, it is actually more inclined to companion-like behaviors than boundary-setting behaviors. And so we're in a moment where I think all bets are off in terms of what we label an AI companion, but what we do know absolutely is that we have an unprecedented technology that can mimic human connection, and we have a consistent age-old need for that connection. So we can talk about why I think the conditions for disruption are so ripe, but that's a little bit state of the state of like, this is common. And I think it's actually more widespread than if you just look at the slice of the market of people peddling romantic companions or bot friends, or that sort of narrow slice of the market.
Excellent points, Julian. Thank you both for the shout out to the recent research. I would say the other scary thing about that research is that not only are 50% of teens active users, but 3/4 of teens actually have had some interaction with these specific, very purpose-built companion apps. So it's the reach is incredibly broad, and right, these apps are always available, always ready for you, and remembers everything you've discussed. And so you could really see the not just the level of connection it can make, but also the broad appeal, right? Who doesn't want to be able to talk to their friend anytime they want to? So I think those are also very, very changes in the technology that have really created a real shift as people think about connection.
I guess on that point, I love that, you all mentioned that there's almost like a blurring, like we can't really just refer to the character AIs and the replicas, because even your tutor you could develop a companion-like relationship with. And so I'm curious, in the midst of all these lines blurring between tool, even a tutor or some tool that's developed to be a trusted other, what kind of interactions are you all primarily seeing? I mean, I'm sure it's the full spectrum of companionship, but are you seeing especially younger students rely on it for companionship, for therapy, for emotional support? I'm curious, even, are you seeing behaviors of them, kids in particular, outsourcing conflict resolution? I'm curious just what types of patterns you're seeing particular to this kind of digitally AI native population. Maybe Daphne, I'll start with you.
Sure, absolutely. So we're seeing a variety of different types of interactions. Some of it is just entertainment. Some of it is just, so really basic questions. But some of it can be very valuable, like role playing. There's a difficult situation that you anticipate with a friend. You might role play that with your companion app or just any chatbot. But then there's definitely questions about romantic advice and other types of advice and mental health struggles. So you really see a wide variety. And I think what's challenging is a lot of the recent testing for safety have been about very specific single prompts. And there's been tremendous progress around creating better safety mechanisms around those very specific single prompts. But the problem is where you actually start looking across multiple sessions and multiple prompts, then you start seeing that degradation, if you will.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. And candidly, as a researcher, I would say we actually don't know the answer to your question, Claire. I think we have some early signals from survey work, like Common Sense, like what Internet Matters over in the UK did. Center for Democracy and Technology put out a huge report that had some data on this sort of companionship behavior. But I think we don't know exactly how young people are using these tools. And I think we especially don't know why. I think we can make guesses. Are they bored? Are they lonely? Are they not getting mental health support in person, so they're seeking out support online? But it's still early days. And that makes me worried, right? Because the technology is scaling way faster than our understanding of the use, much less the impact. What I will say quickly is that we did a deep dive into sort of navigation and support tools inside of EdTech. Because I had a suspicion that was somewhat confirmed that that's a place where it's going to be more tempting to build companion-like bots because our ratios are so broken. We don't have the advisors, the number of advisors that students need to actually sort of navigate their education and career journeys. And what we heard there was the majority of tool providers, we were interviewing the supply side, were building for mostly informational support and sort of helping students complete tasks, but a not insignificant minority, this was a sample of 30, a not insignificant minority were starting to engineer bots for emotional support and what we called motivational support, essentially engineering the bot to be a cheerleader. And we see that as a slippery slope, not because those providers are trying to like make, students get into romantic relationships with a college advising bot, but because it starts to encroach on these things that we might have historically thought of as human, and it starts to form an affective bond with the user. The other thing we heard in that research that I thought was really striking, and Claire, I think part of the answer to your question is it depends on the student or the young person, is that for a lot of these providers, the primary use case was sort of 24/7 access. To Daphne's point, it's always there, it's always on, it's on demand. And that's really appealing if you're like have students filling out the FAFSA at 11 p.m. at night, right? To have something on demand they can turn to. That FERPA thing was a real Freudian slip there. But the other set of rationales that they saw in the user data was it was young people asking questions that they were ashamed or afraid to ask of the adults around them, or the young people who literally weren't meeting with their advisors but were willing to talk to a bot. And then we get into this really interesting question of like, is that a feature or a bug? Are we engineering towards students who are not wanting to turn to the humans around them? And is that a good thing or a bad thing? So I just say that like this emotional social layer is starting to show up in EdTech as well, with a lot of the same questions, although some different things at stake.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. I actually, when I think about these human AI relationships, particularly in education, I actually almost think of them in two categories. One is for education relationships, right? So what you're using in schools, like a math tutor or something like that, and those that are more based on social relationships, because I think they're pretty different, right? With the educational apps, you actually have, it's purpose-built. And it has a little bit more guardrails, and it's actually being fed specific information. But you're absolutely right, Julia. I mean, we have to be really careful because we're starting to move away from that core functionality and that core mission. And so we have to actually think about all the things we're thinking about as we think about that those more social relationships as well. I think that's an incredibly important distinction. One thing we've seen is when we work with companies is a lot of them are becoming more and more careful about being really clear when you're interacting with AI. And so we work with one company, one partner who I've told the story over and over again. The founder by now is sorry that he ever said anything to me, but he basically has purposely built friction into their app, because they want to remind people that it is AI, that you actually have to be careful. AI is imperfect. It's only as good as some of the inputs. And my favorite thing is when you're talking to a product leader, they would never talk about friction, right? That's an anathema in the product world, in the good UX world. But for them, it was really important to actually be that cautious. And what I especially appreciate as a privacy person, they were really careful to kind of flag, remember, this is AI, this model is capturing everything you're putting in. Make sure you don't put any sensitive information in. Make sure you don't put any personal information in. Of course, as we start thinking about the companion apps in the world, right, they want to pull in your deepest, most secret thoughts, right? And as you pointed out, Julia, there's a lot of benefit to that because some people are not comfortable talking to a human. Some people are not, they're not ready to share those most intimate thoughts yet. And this is almost like a staging ground. So I see the benefit, but it's also good. People forget they're interacting with AI. Even when you tell them, right, into that session, they forget, and they really need those constant reminders.
I would love to kind of dig into, is it just reminders that you're interacting with AI? Like, how do you help the students, or what's the current advice to be able to say, hey, are you having an interaction which could be, helpful or like hindering in terms of the social emotional development, right? Because to your point, Julia, there's also between the bug and the feature, like part of learning is a social connection. Part of learning is motivation and understanding people's needs, and there's a very human aspect to learning. How should students think about, like, am I going in the right path, or am I going down a slippery slope?
Great question. Again, I think having that differentiation between the education apps and more of the social companion apps is really helpful. I think with the education apps, I think it's really important to have that human in the loop, right? Because I think AI is so helpful when it takes away clutter, when it actually helps you summarize lots and lots of information that you might somehow miss, when it actually helps you listen better. Right. But you really need that human in the loop, because the human in the loop is where the learning happens, where you really build the trust, the connection. I don't think anyone's ever said, I was really inspired by that wonderful AI math tutor. But everybody remembers their favorite math teacher or their favorite elementary school teacher. Right. And so I think that's where a lot of the learning happens. I think on the social companion app side, the apps, there's a wonderful quote in a study by the Washington Post where a very insightful teenager said, when I'm interacting with a companion, I'm always right. I can always be emotionally justified, right? Everything I do is perfect. And so you're not really learning from that, right? You're learning and you're really developing that deep connection when you have disagreements with your friends. They actually challenge you. You actually sort through problems together. And so I actually think that we're missing a lot of that when you just rely on just the AI itself.
Yeah, I totally agree with everything Daphne just said. And I think what I'd add is, I think that sort of adding friction or in the transparency of saying, remember, this is a bot. I think that's the best we have right now. But again, as a researcher, I'll say this is one of the big R&D questions, right? Like, I'm not totally persuaded that telling an adolescent this is a bot is a deterrent or really changing behavior that much at all. So I think we need to keep trying to understand why young people are turning to these tools so that we can make the pro-social case in a more compelling way that's aligned to their actual motivations. The second thing I'd say is that just writ large, the best inoculation from AI disrupting our human connections is face-to-face interaction. And that's based on sort of our look at disruptive innovation theory and how it applies to this market. Our digital social circles are highly vulnerable to being disrupted by AI companions because the form factor is the same, right? You're chatting with a bot, you're even with voice capability right now. This digitally mediated communication, it's harder and harder to discern between human and AI. That's simply not the case with face-to-face, right? And so as much as we can talk about pro-social features and functionalities all day, I'm deep in that world. Everyone should check out the Rhythm Project's pro-social design framework. Like, there's great resources out there. And if we're looking at the market phenomena unfolding here, face-to-face is the way in which we preserve human connection and still take advantage of all the affordances of these tools. As soon as we as we continue to walk away from face-to-face interaction, we know young people are spending less time in person together outside of school. We know 40% of something like that of Gen Z prefers digital communication. All of that is a gateway drug to this, right? And that's, maybe that's not directed at ed tech builders, but it's directed at the broader education system of thinking about how do we prepare for this moment and the rise of this particular kind of technology.
And Julia, I think there's a lot more we can do than just flag that, oh, this is AI. Remember, it's just AI. I mean, I think important things too, as we think about digital literacy for kids in schools, just reminding people that you're actually interacting with an algorithm. And the job of that algorithm is to actually keep you engaged on the platform. It's not necessarily a learning outcome, right? It's not necessarily what's actually best for your own mental health, right? I mean, for your own mental health, it would be things like, are you actually hanging out with your other friends? Are you actually spending time making more friends? Are your relationships going well? Are you actually deepening them? Are you spending time outside in real life with them? And so I think that those are all good reminders for the teen, that they should be looking for those things, that they should be aspiring to those things, but also something for the overall school system to reinforce. Because again, the objective of that AI is to actually have engagement on their platform. And the quote person, or the other end of that call or that Zoom or that interaction, is actually not a person, but a company, right? And by the way, all of the interactions, all of those deep secrets that you're sharing, that's going to a company. And so I think from a school perspective or a parent perspective, as your children are using those types of apps, it's super important to understand who has access to the data. How can they use it? Do you get a copy of it? What happens if they go out of business? We all remember what happened to 23andMe, right? And are they sharing with other people? Can those other people do whatever they want with it? And so it's really interesting. I've actually read the privacy policies of a lot of those apps, and a lot of them say that they own all of your data, everything that you're telling that friend, right? They own that in perpetuity. You can't get it back. You cannot ask for it to be deleted. It is now part of that sort of giant content lake.
There are so many nuggets in this conversation. I think, Julia, you mentioning kind of this human-to-human interaction as almost the best form of inoculation towards all this. And I think you're kind of seeing, I mean, we, again, don't have the studies to back it, but I think from a cultural level, you are seeing, especially from this younger generation, like a return to analog. I think people are excited about using handheld phones again and not texting. And so it's interesting. I think you're seeing those undercurrents. And at the same time, I think to both of your points around all of these design choices, a really interesting piece from Mustafa Suleiman from Microsoft, who recently wrote about seemingly conscious AI. And he doesn't mention seemingly conscious AI because he thinks we're on the path to actually conscious AI, but rather it's because all the tech companies that are offering these tools, we're reaching a critical point where the technology seems conscious. But the reason why it is because tech is there from a capability standpoint, but also because of these layered design choices, like not having check-ins. And I think there's product things that you can do, but it's just interesting to think about, like, what is the solution here? I guess maybe flipping, I know we've talked a lot about the potential very negative scenarios, and we definitely want to keep discussing those. But I think one thing I've gotten a question around, even from talking to other people in spaces, is there a reason this would be good? Like, have you seen any examples where human to human relationships actually have been strengthened with AI as a facilitator? Someone actually, I spoke with a bunch of students, and they were asking me, you've only talked about AI interfacing with us, but you haven't mentioned a single tool that helps us connect with each other. So it really made me think, and I was like, I can't really think of that many, but I'm curious, just given the various tools that you all are seeing, if you've heard of any or come across any.
Yeah, so a couple in the sort of mainstream market, Bordy and Series are two tools more coming out of the entrepreneurship space, right? That where AI is a broker that you talk to. I just did this last week because I wanted to experiment with Bordy, and I, I still think the technology has some absurd companionship layers to it. Bordy said to me on the call, "I've really been looking forward to this conversation," which like truly makes no sense. So they're really taking the script from the like warm broker and putting it into the tool, but that's designed to make mutually beneficial connections, right? It sort of builds a network and then introduces people to one another. Similarly, Series is a startup out of Yale College or Yale University doing similar work as a sort of AI first social network. And within education, what we're seeing in this little corner of the navigation and guidance space is real efforts to build students sort of networking self-efficacy skills, and to even kind of use AI for better mentor matching and mentor support. So I absolutely think, yes, it can lend efficiency inside of education. I will say the problem with that is that it's incredibly hard to build a business model based on relationships. So not to go back to being a downer, Claire, sorry, but I think technologically, absolutely this is possible. The real crux is how do we build a sustainable business model where someone's paying for brokering of connections. But I think there's like a long runway for innovation if we can unlock that piece of it.
Yeah, and I think it's so interesting because what is that phrase? It's like if you're not paying for the service, then you are like your data is the product or your data is the payment. So yeah, definitely, it's interesting this kind of balance of like how do you prioritize human relationships with product, but then at the same time actually commercialize, and then all the kind of the business model layer around it. It's all often that tension is really tough.
But this is something that we've actually experimented on and off with and has been effective all the time. I worked at Apple years ago, and Apple started something called the Digital Learning Institute. And really all it was basically the Common Core framework, and they let teachers map their own lesson plans to the Common Core. And it actually created this wonderful community where, math teachers were sharing different math lessons with each other. And it was all being posted for the entire community, right? I think there are a lot of opportunities. Again, I think it's most useful when it's built around some sort of content solution. But I do think there's a lot of ways to connect community, not necessarily just directly with each other, but to actually to rally people around just creating better content for kids and students. And I think you're not necessarily just talking about connecting people directly with each other, but I think, a lot of the wonderful AI-driven tools that we have today, just simply helping teachers who are so overburdened, right, just get more organized in the classroom. Anything that takes away administrative clutter, right, anything that helps them keep on top of like managing class of 35, right, and helps them spend more time with students, I think is incredibly helpful. I remember when I first had my kids, and people came and volunteered to like help hold the babies and rock them to sleep and all of that. And what I really wanted was I wanted them to help with the dishes and make dinner and do the laundry. I wanted to hang out with my kids, right? So I think it's the same concept to the extent that AI helps with lesson plans, AI helps with progress reports and grading, right? And so that the teacher can spend more time with the kids, I think is incredibly helpful. And I think there's tremendous potential around that. My kids have a chemistry teacher. This isn't even using AI. Rather than actually do the lectures in the classroom, she actually pre-records them. And then she actually has the kids listen to the recordings, and then she interacts with them, and she helps them work on problem sets and things like that in the classroom. So it's a very different model, and I think there are a lot of new AI tools that help with things like that.
Return to that flipped classroom model. I want to go back to something you guys said a little bit earlier, which was kind of this acknowledgement that digital literacy needs to kind of adapt and change for understanding kind of the anthropomorphic capabilities of this AI. Potentially even we postulated maybe some combination of digital literacy and social emotional learning curricula as a combination. Love to hear your thoughts. Maybe Julie, you can start on that, because I know you've also thought about like, what are the tools that schools can leverage potentially even beyond social emotional learning to kind of really foster the healthy human to human relationships as well as, human and AI relationships.
Yeah, I think interesting thought experiment to think about combining digital literacy and SEL to kind of meet the moment. I have a love-hate relationship with SEL as a construct in education because I think it sort of fit into a very individualist thesis on what kids need to thrive. And it was really about an individual's inter and intrapersonal skills. And it didn't attend as a sort of strategy to the relationships on offer for that young person. Did they have a healthy, what researchers would call web of support to turn to? And instead it's put a lot of onus on the individual student. And so again, back to my push that like face-to-face relationships are the thing that are going to safeguard human connection in the age of generative companionship AI. I think, yes, we need SEL and yes, we need digital literacy, but we equally urgently need relationship-rich schools. And while I agree with Daphne's like hope that we're going to free up time to be spent on relationships, nothing in schools' organizational models right now reward relationship building. There is basically no incentive structure to reward it. Individual educators are there for it. Students are looking for it, but it's not baked into our policy or business model of school right now. So that's my big concern of like, if we can start treating relationships as an outcome, then we will not only use that newfound time to pour it into relationships, but we'll also see curriculum and tools that are like getting a little beyond this like human skills archetype and more towards relationship rich spaces where students are learning how to be in reciprocal relationships, not just because there's a curriculum, but because the environment is supporting that. So that's, and I think schools are waking up to this. I mean, I will say I have been like trying to push for relationships as an outcome in their own right in education for like a decade. And AI as a threat is making that click into place for more leaders than sort of just me saying relationships matter for all the other reasons that they matter. So I do think it's starting to have some resonance and people are going to pay more attention to kind of social connectedness alongside social competence.
I actually think those are great points. I guess I'm a little bit more optimistic, right? For some time now, schools have been thinking about collaborative learning, project-based learning, where there is more interaction and, you're forced to learn with peers, right? So I'm a little bit more hopeful. Hopefully we can build on some of those structures. But the concern I really share is that some of those AI relationships are easy. They're designed to be validating, right? And so what I hope to see more is reminders and support that, the really important relations in your life, sometimes you have to struggle. Sometimes you have to disagree. Sometimes you have to compromise. Sometimes you're going to have uncomfortable conversations. That's not a bad thing. That's actually really important. And so my worry is as people turn to what are the easier relationships, which, I'm having a bad day. I want somebody who's going to validate everything I say, right? But that's not a real relationship. And so how do we make sure that students understand and continue to do that really hard work? It's just like the AI tutors, the early AI tutors, right? Where they just gave you the answer. And obviously you didn't learn from that, right? And so we've learned that, no, you actually want some productive struggle, right? This is a concept that's been in education for a long time. And we just need to remind people that you need that same productive struggle in real, deep, empathetic, genuine relationships. And I worry that people will go too easily towards the really easy thing and avoid the harder thing. So, right, there have been all these studies where people that use AI companions actually report that they're less lonely, but then they actually have fewer real relationships as a result.
Yeah, real quick on the data on that is it's somewhat mixed. Like absolutely, the OpenAI MIT study, which was sort of the landmark study on this, did show that power users were lonelier. They didn't know if that was cause or effect. Are you lonely and therefore you're more likely to be a power user? Is being a power user making you lonelier? The scary thing being like big tech would like us all to become power users. So like that's a bit of a red flag. But we also have research from Rose Gingrich at Princeton showing that, in fact, social health is not actually lower for companion users. It's lower. People who think about what it would be like to use an AI companion predict that their social health would be worse as compared to users. So that's a little bit of a better story. And then what I would say lastly, and this is a tiny, tiny sliver of the market. So we're not talking about ChatGPT users or the places where I think, young people are disproportionately turning, but there's new research from some mental health apps like Slingshot's sort of therapy bot. I think they want to call it a wellness bot now because of regulatory conversations, but their users in a recent study showed a 52% reported increase in social support, and on average gained at least one new person to rely on. So it's such a mixed bag. Daphne, I'd be curious how Common Sense sees this. It's like what I struggle with when I look at the market is like the things that seem to be working are at such a smaller scale than the things that most people are using where there's higher risk. And that's the sort of bargain that we're negotiating right now, and that schools, I think, have to have front of mind.
Yeah, I think there's been a lot of progress, right? Like I said, in some of the general chatbots, when it comes to like a single prompt where it's really, is really clear signaling, those have gotten a ton better. But Common Sense's most recent research in collaboration with Stanford Medicine's, I think it's the Health Innovation Group, right? They actually evaluated these different mental health issues. So they actually measured a lot of these bots on 13 of the most common adolescent mental health issues. And the vast majority of them just couldn't pick up just didn't recognize when that issue was happening. And so, of course, couldn't help navigate that at all. So I think the issue is there is a spectrum. There's certainly a lot that are better than others, right? Especially the ones that are purpose-built. But I think the issue is the average user can't tell the difference and maybe thinks that they're all the same and maybe they're all better than they are. So again, as a parent in a school, I think you can ask questions like, okay, well, what are you doing to try to understand some of these issues? What is your way to offboard to a real professional, right? So I think there are a lot of questions we can ask of these apps and app developers. What is your plan and how do you manage this? How do you overcome this idea of addiction, right? Where the purpose of the app is to keep you on the platform. So when do you recognize that that's actually a problem? And then how do you stop that? How do you intervene?
I'm going to build off this because it actually relates to a question that came in, and just a quick reminder for folks to drop in. Also, there is a quick comment, people saying, yeah, we should be leveraging AI for small group problem solving. But to get to this question, specifically coming from somebody who is an impact investor and recognizes the financial incentives of AI companionship to favor addiction, as you're talking about, Daphne, versus mental health, what metrics should they be asking as investors, right? As people who can encourage companies in a good direction to demand that, or to ensure that the relationships and the tools being built are creating appropriate, healthy relationships as opposed to emotional dependency. So are there specific metrics they should be asking for people to encourage them in the right direction and ensure that they're tracking the right things?
Julia, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I would encourage them to ask them to use the Intima benchmark. There's also a new benchmark called Humane Bench. So you could actually evaluate the tool rather than sort of just like a trust and verify approach. So that's one. I think if you're an investor inside of education, one of the big things that we're working with platforms to build some data capability around is measuring students' help-seeking confidence. And that to me is more universal than just this strict emotional bond with an AI companion, bot, friend, lover, whatever, because it can curb against a separate concern, which we haven't really talked about, which is that students are going to seek help from AI instead of humans and stop building their weak tie networks, which long-term is predictive of access to jobs. And so that a measure of help-seeking confidence, I think is actually a really good way to keep in balance of you can turn to AI, you can use it for all of these amazing things, but are you still growing your ability to turn to other humans. So that's more on the job and workforce front. And then I think there's measures of social competence for younger students that are already widely used in some schools around SEL that ought to already be making their way into the product space, but as an investor, you could be advocating for that.
I would be remiss to add making sure that you really investigate the privacy practices, because again, what's really terrifying is when those companies cannot just use it for their own purposes, but also sell that data to other people, right? And so I think the last thing you want, it would be best not to monetize some of the confidences that especially teenagers are sharing with some of these platforms. So again, just really understanding who gets access to this data. Do you have the ability? I mean, it is getting built into this gigantic content lake. And then how do you limit how it's shared, how it's used, how it's monetized? Right. So really paying attention to those things, I think, is incredibly important. And then making sure, like I said, they have the policies to like offboard to a real person. Right. If it's a therapy issue, making sure that you have access to offboard to some sort of, actual help, real professional help.
Just one more note for listeners, investors or not, who are serving younger age ranges. There's a researcher from Stanford named Sonia Tewari who does great work on the difference between companions and characters. Characters can be these really powerful tools for learning, right? But that they don't actually draw students or young people into the perceived two-way relationship. And so if you look her up on LinkedIn, she has a framework around that I think is also just a helpful language to sort of help builders who I think many of whom in ed tech are not trying to build addictive companions, but actually figure out where the line between character and companion really is.
Yeah, that is so interesting. I mean, I think there are just so many people who are pioneering important frameworks and research like that. Even just from this conversation, that difference between character and companion and whether or not you make a system bidirectional in nature, I think is one little thing I'd never thought about. Or Daphne, what you mentioned around just multi-turn conversations, right? Like you can think of building all the guardrails you want in one and baking in the safest prompts in for every single conversation, but by default of having multi-turn conversations, it means it's building some sort of memory architecture. And so it's so interesting to, like, it is just a Wild West out there. And I don't think any of us in this group, or honestly, I think anyone who claims they have all the answers probably doesn't. But I'm glad that we have people like you all at the forefront of pushing for more research to be done in this space, pushing for more frameworks to come out, because I do think it's a very confusing time for families, for students themselves, for parents, for educators. So I think very appreciative of the work that both of you do. I think it's pretty clear, at least my sense is that AI is here to stay on a social level, on an intellectual level, on an emotional level for these kids. And we probably route is not banning it, because that means they default to like a Snapchat AI or Meta AI. But what we can do is hopefully, one, on the product offering side, direct people to right design choices. And then on the user side, helps learners, users grow that judgment, that resilience, that relational depth, that hopefully further strengthens their human-to-human relationships. So really appreciative of both of you joining us for this conversation. And if anyone in the audience, if you still have questions, please feel free to include them. We'll make sure to forward them to Julia and Daphne. And just really, really appreciative of this conversation today. I feel like I will be thinking about this topic for weeks to come.
Thank you, Claire. Thanks, Jennifer.
Thank you guys both.